Tonight, we delve into the hidden world behind convent walls, where piety and chastity were diligently preached, but not always consistently practiced. Because while the Middle Ages left behind grand cathedrals and sacred manuscripts, they also left behind court records, detailed confessions, and revealing letters that expose a far less saintly side of medieval nuns. One that includes secret lovers, hidden pregnancies, daring escape tunnels, and even full-blown orgies conducted under the deceptive guise of spiritual ecstasy. So, before you get comfortable, please consider taking a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And do let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, perhaps turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's intriguing journey together. When a woman entered a medieval convent, she was expected to leave the world behind, along with her dresses, jewelry, and even her family name. In theory, she also surrendered her right to any physical affection, ever again. She became, in concept, a bride of Christ. In practice, this spiritual marriage was often open to individual interpretation. The vow of chastity was considered serious business. No touching, no flirting, and most definitely no midnight rendezvous in the cloister garden with Brother Thomas from down the hill. But as any good historian or bishop with a persistent headache will tell you, vows are only as binding as the will to follow them. And in many convents, that will proved surprisingly flexible. For some nuns, the vow of chastity was treated more like a suggestion. After all, if you're confined behind stone walls for decades, surrounded only by other women and the occasional suspiciously handsome confessor, moral lines could become very, very blurry. Some got remarkably creative. There were whispered arguments that affection didn't count if it wasn't intentional. Others leaned into clever spiritual loopholes. If Christ was your heavenly husband, then who could possibly object to a little passion, mystical or otherwise, especially if you meticulously wrote it down in Latin? Reports from church officials, dispatched to ensure everything remained pure and pious, frequently contained delicately phrased complaints, such as excessive familiarity between sisters or unescorted male visitors to the orchard. Translated, this meant someone was misbehaving, and it was likely happening near the apple trees. Then there were the convents that operated more like aristocratic dormitories. Wealthy families would dispatch their troublesome daughters with the clear expectation that someone else would handle their youthful enthusiasm. Some convents tried to enforce strict rules, others simply shrugged and hoped the bishop didn't visit too often. Of course, not every nun strayed. Many genuinely lived devout lives, dedicating themselves to prayer, study, and baking bread that could literally dent a helmet. But others, let's just say they interpreted the rule of chastity the way people today interpret unlimited breadsticks. So yes, chastity was written in ink, sworn before God, and embroidered into the rule books. But behind those quiet walls, things were occasionally profoundly rewritten. Pregnancy, as a general rule, is notoriously difficult to explain away, even more so when you're a nun. While you might successfully conceal a secret lover or smuggle in a wheel of contraband cheese, a growing belly was significantly harder to tuck discreetly under a habit. It was even harder to explain without implicating at least one person, several sins, and occasionally a very confused donkey. Medieval convents were theoretically meant to be sanctuaries of unwavering chastity, but reality often had other more inconvenient ideas. Church records, bishops' complaints, and truly scandalized abbesses all consistently point to one undeniable truth: nuns were getting pregnant. Not hypothetically, not symbolically, but physically, undeniably, and inconveniently pregnant. The excuses offered were often remarkably creative. Some claimed demonic possession. Others cited miraculous conception, which, while technically supported by biblical precedent, was generally met with extreme skepticism when it occurred 3 towns over and involved Brother Jacques, the choir director. One nun even famously claimed she fell on a man, a defense difficult to refute given the immutable laws of gravity. Once discovered, convents typically reacted with a flurry of panic and strategic memory loss. The pregnant nun would be swiftly dispatched on a retreat or suddenly develop a prolonged illness requiring total seclusion. If she gave birth, the baby might be whisked away under the cover of night, either to a foundling home, a sympathetic relative, or, in darker cases, to places far less desirable. Some infants were quietly interred on convent grounds, with headstones that read like vague apologies to God. The father was always the next pressing question, and the answers varied wildly. Priests, traveling nobles, humble gardeners. In one particularly memorable trial, the accused was a wandering musician with a harp and an indecent smile. No further explanation was given or apparently needed. Punishment was equally inconsistent. Peasant-born nuns might face excommunication and be sent away in disgrace. Noble-born sisters, on the other hand, often received stern warnings and a convenient sabbatical. One particularly brazen abbess was caught with a lover and a child and still somehow managed to retain her position. Clearly, medieval management operated under different rules. Of course, the Church consistently maintained these were isolated incidents, rare, tragic, and deeply regrettable. And yet, the archival paper trail tells a different story. Parchment, it seems, does not lie, especially when it's soaked in scandal. If there's one thing medieval convents consistently underestimated, it was the enduring power of stationery. Love within the cloister was a delicate operation, silent, meticulously coded, and often expressed with the kind of flowery Latin that could be interpreted either as a fervent romantic confession or an intensely spiritual prayer. Nuns may have taken vows of silence, but their quills were far less obedient. Letters became everything when risky face-to-face trysts were impossible and meaningful glances across the chapel proved insufficient. Love found its intricate loophole through ink and wax. Some letters were discreetly slipped through cracks in the cloister wall. Others were cunningly tucked into loaves of bread or passed via suspiciously helpful novices with remarkably unreadable poker faces. The contents ranged from sweetly sentimental to utterly unprintable. One nun wrote to her priest lover that she longed to drink of his chalice of devotion. The bishop investigating the case was so profoundly unsettled that he ordered the letter burned, twice, just to be absolutely certain. These secret romances were not always fleeting, transient affairs either. Some persisted for years. One nun in France maintained a passionate correspondence with a young nobleman for over a decade, outliving 2 abbesses and at least 3 failed attempts to expose her. She was finally caught after quoting Ovid a little too accurately in the convent's choir book, naturally. The Church, predictably, took a dim view of this literary lust. When letters were discovered, severe punishments followed: excommunication, arduous penance, confinement to solitary prayer, or, in even worse cases, a forced public reading of the incriminating letters before the entire convent, which may have been more humiliating than any divine judgment. As for the lovers, if they were men of the cloth, they were typically reassigned to a colder, less romantic post. If they were laymen, well, one was once flogged, fined, and explicitly ordered to never again speak to women of the cloth, or otherwise. His reported reply, "Can I still write?" Even more mortifying were the instances where love letters were intercepted and circulated like medieval gossip columns. Imagine spending hours meticulously composing your deepest, holiest affections, only for them to be read aloud by a giggling novice over midday meal and cheese. Still, the ink continued to flow, because when walls were high and eyes were watching, love adapted with metaphor, innuendo, and very determined handwriting. In theory, a convent was conceived as a fortress of purity. In reality, it often operated more like a boarding school with imposing walls and, in some intriguing cases, a surprising number of viable escape routes. Medieval nuns weren't merely spiritually restless. Some were remarkably physically inventive. And if you're envisioning dainty women gently tiptoeing through a rose garden gate, you'd be mistaken. Some of these audacious escape attempts involve scaling walls with bed sheets, bribing complacent guards, crawling through constricted underground drains, and in one memorable instance, ingeniously dressing as a monk and calmly walking out the front door as if it were just a normal Tuesday. The motivations for these escapes varied. Some fled to joyfully reunite with secret lovers. Others simply despised the rigid strictures of monastic life. A few simply wished to return home after realizing that eternal silence meant precisely that, even during meals. Perhaps the most legendary of all escapees was Sister Benedetta of Verona. Sent to the convent at the tender age of 14, she made 3 distinct attempts to flee. On her third audacious try, she cunningly disguised herself as a novice from a neighboring abbey, forged travel papers, and managed to escape on a cart filled with vegetables. She reportedly made it halfway to Venice before being apprehended. Not because of her clever disguise, but because she couldn't resist trying to flirt with a passing guard. Some escapes were far more dramatic. In Saxony, a group of nuns staged a collective breakout after their abbess unilaterally banned music. They reportedly overpowered the gatekeeper with a loaf of stale bread and vanished into the dense woods. Church authorities later described them as disoriented and unrepentant, which frankly sounds like the perfect tagline for an excellent medieval drama. When apprehended, escaped nuns were typically hauled back and subjected to some delightful combination of public shame, prolonged fasting, and confinement to a cold stone room with nothing but a crucifix and profound disappointment. Repeat offenders, and there were many, might be transferred to even stricter convents where the food was worse and the walls were considerably higher. But for some, even that wasn't enough to extinguish the flame of rebellion. A few nuns successfully escaped, married their lovers, and lived out their days pretending they'd never even seen a cloister, let alone resided in one. Because sometimes the habit just didn't fit, and the window was invitingly open. Every scandal has its icon, and in the annals of convent impropriety, Sister Agnes of Würzburg unequivocally deserves her own stained glass window, preferably one that blushes. Agnes was, by all accounts, an intelligent and charming nun with a notable gift for music, prayer, and hosting a knight in her cell for over a year. Yes, a knight, a real one, complete with armor, a sword, and probably some tragic backstory. His name has been lost to history, which is suspicious in itself, but what we do know is that he was reportedly recovering from wounds sustained in battle. Where precisely this battle took place is unclear. It may have been in a field, a tavern, or perhaps the convent courtyard after he stumbled trying to sneak in. According to the bishop's records, the knight was discovered after a novice reported strange clanking noises emanating from Agnes's cell. Upon investigation, church officials found the man discreetly hiding behind a tapestry, eating preserved figs and humming hymns to pass the time. His only defense: Sister Agnes is a healer of both body and soul. Agnes, to her credit, did not deny the affair. In fact, she seemed genuinely annoyed to be interrupted. She stated that she was caring for the wounded and that compassion is a holy virtue, which is true, though rarely invoked to justify cohabitation with a chain-mailed boyfriend. The scandal rocked the convent, not just because of the illicit affair, but because of its astonishing duration. A few weeks, even a secret rendezvous, might have been forgivable. But 12 months, during which the knight was seen at least twice wearing a borrowed monk's robe and even helping with garden chores, that required planning and serious commitment. The fallout was swift and theatrical. Agnes was stripped of her position, publicly shamed, and reassigned to a stricter order. The knight was fined and exiled, though one record dryly notes that he did not seem regretful, which is probably the most medieval way of saying he smirked the entire time. As for Agnes, she later wrote letters vehemently protesting the church's hypocrisy, quoting scripture and medical texts in her defense. One line particularly stood out: "Had I let him die, I'd be a sinner still." Not all scandals in medieval convents involved sneaking knights or clandestine letters. Some were louder, expressed through moans, weeping, and trembling in full public view, all while claiming to be in direct contact with the divine. Enter the mystic nun. In the Middle Ages, certain nuns were renowned for experiencing ecstatic religious visions. These weren't your average quiet moments of serene reflection. No, these were full-bodied, eyes rolled back, trembling on the floor spiritual encounters. And while some church officials deemed them holy, others harbored questions. Mostly, why did these visions sound so enthusiastic? Take Sister Beatrix, a nun from the Low Countries, who boldly claimed Christ came to her nightly, not metaphorically, but physically. Her writings described embraces of divine warmth and spiritual union beyond the veil of flesh. At one point, she declared herself wedded to the Lamb, which might sound innocent until you read the sections where she compared his presence to a fire that spread within and without. Subtle. Then there's Hadwig of Antwerp, a 13th century mystic whose poetry reads like the medieval version of a steamy romance novel, if that novel were set entirely inside a chapel. She wrote of consuming love and being pierced by divine light. Some of her lines were so vivid that later church scholars desperately tried to edit them into more appropriate metaphors. The original versions, however, are preserved and decidedly eyebrow-raising. To be fair, not every nun faked their ecstasy. Many were genuinely sincere. Medieval theology did indeed encourage intense emotional relationships with Christ, sometimes verging into language that modern readers might file under PG-13. But sincerity doesn't negate the fact that these visions caused serious stirrings, both spiritual and otherwise. Not everyone was impressed. Some bishops accused these women of attention-seeking. Others worried about the influence such visions had on younger, more impressionable nuns. One particularly skeptical archbishop famously referred to them as hysteria masquerading as holiness. He was later reassigned, possibly for articulating what everyone else was thinking. Still, some mystic nuns became minor celebrities. Their visions were recorded, copied, and venerated, which, in medieval terms, meant they got away with writing divine fan fiction and calling it theology. If there's one thing medieval monasteries were renowned for, it was rigorous restraint of the body, of the tongue, and especially of the stomach. Fasting was considered holy, hunger a virtue, and appetite a temptation best left in the garden with the serpent. But inside some convents, fasting was more of a daytime suggestion. Because when the bells stopped ringing and the abbess retired to her chamber, a different kind of ritual often began: the forbidden feast. Convents were supposed to maintain a strict diet: porridge, bread, the occasional fish, and an existential crisis for dessert. Meat, rich cheeses, sweets, and wine were generally banned, especially during Lent or any of the dozens of other fasting days that comprised roughly half the year. But let's be honest, no one can subsist on boiled cabbage indefinitely without plotting something. And plot they did. Some nuns developed covert culinary networks. Friendly merchants would discreetly deliver salted meats for medicinal purposes. Wine was cunningly relabeled as consecrated vinegar. Honey cakes were just for visitors who mysteriously never arrived. One surviving convent inventory shockingly included 2 ducks, 1 whole ham, a jug of cherry wine, and 3 wheels of cheese. It was all meticulously cataloged under liturgical supplies. You can draw your own conclusions. Midnight feasts became a regular occurrence. Picture this: a candlelit room deep within the convent, filled with giggling nuns whispering psalms between ravenous bites of roasted goose. One novice reportedly burned her hand sneaking hot pastries out of the oven and attempted to claim it was a punishment from the Holy Spirit. No one believed her, but the pastries were apparently excellent. Sometimes these feasts evolved into social affairs, with visiting men, merchants, priests, or in some cases, men who had no official reason whatsoever to be in a convent after dark. One abbey in Burgundy was famously discovered to be hosting unapproved gatherings, which turned out to be regular Saturday night banquets, complete with dancing, gambling, and what the bishop diplomatically described as inappropriate merriment. Of course, not every nun partook. Many were genuinely devout and horrified by such indulgence. But others, let's just say their idea of fasting was simply eating quickly before someone catches us. Few things unnerved medieval church authorities more than a nun with a visible bump, unless, of course, that bump turned into a baby, and then tragically into a shallow grave beneath the convent pantry. One of the most chilling scandals emerged from a 14th century French convent where rumors began to swirl of strange noises coming from the cellar. It wasn't rats, it wasn't bad plumbing, it was, as one horrified novice described, something crying that had no right to be there. When church investigators arrived, they anticipated the usual: a wine stash, some forbidden cheese, perhaps a clandestine love letter or two. What they found instead was a hastily dug patch of disturbed earth beneath a barrel of pickled cabbage. Underneath lay the tiny body of a newborn child, wrapped in what was clearly a torn wimple, the distinctive headdress worn by the sisters. The implication was anything but subtle. The ensuing investigation was as delicate as navigating a plague cart. The mother was never officially named, though several nuns were conveniently relocated shortly afterward, a common euphemism for "please disappear quietly before this becomes a full-blown trial." The abbess, when questioned, feigned complete ignorance. "I was not informed of any childbirth," she stated, while standing next to a suspiciously well-used wash basin. She added that any woman who gave birth in the convent had clearly entered already pregnant, one of the oldest and least effective explanations in the scandal playbook. This wasn't an isolated incident. Across Europe, hidden pregnancies occasionally resulted in tragic ends. Babies were left at the doors of monasteries, some were smuggled out to sympathetic families, a few, heartbreakingly, didn't survive long enough for either option. The church responded with its usual cocktail of outrage and selective amnesia. Punishments ranged from public penance to quiet transfers. But as long as the walls remained high and the incriminating letters stayed hidden, many such stories were buried, both literally and figuratively. Still, every time a cellar was repaved or a pantry reorganized, there was the faint, unsettling possibility of another discovery, a tiny scandal wrapped in linen and profound silence. If there's a scale of things nuns were decidedly not supposed to do, opening a brothel lands somewhere between heresy and throwing a bishop out a window. But in 15th century Bologna, one former nun named Sister Clara decided she'd had quite enough of vows, veils, and virtue. So she left the convent and, astonishingly, opened a highly successful brothel in her old convent building, with the habits still in use, because subtlety was apparently not part of her business plan. Clara hadn't exactly been cloister material to begin with. Church records describe her as willful and frequently absent from vespers. Translated, this means she didn't show up for prayer and possibly had other plans involving wine and someone named Marco. Her decision to leave the convent wasn't particularly dramatic. She simply walked out and never returned. The real drama commenced later, when passers-by noticed the convent had suddenly become extraordinarily popular with men who had no known interest in theology. According to a local magistrate, Clara employed women, some ex-nuns, others just creatively unemployed, and ran the establishment with remarkable military efficiency. Clients reportedly paid extra for costumes. Some men even requested the full confession experience, which raises theological questions no one was prepared to answer. When word eventually reached the church, panic ensued. Not because prostitution was rare, it wasn't, but because this particular brothel had the audacity to look like a convent and reportedly functioned better than most monasteries. The optics were terrible. Clara, when summoned to explain herself, simply shrugged and stated, "At least no one here pretends to be chaste." She was promptly excommunicated, then re-excommunicated, just to be absolutely certain. The building was seized, the operation dismantled, and Clara was allegedly sent to a nunnery far from Bologna, which seems like an odd choice, but perhaps poetic justice. Yet her legacy lingered. For years afterward, the site was colloquially known as the Cloister of Delight. It even appeared in bawdy plays and songs. And though the church tried desperately to erase her memory, Clara became something of a folk legend, the nun who skipped salvation and instead ventured into hospitality. Confession, the spiritual reset button of medieval Catholicism, was supposed to be a solemn ritual of self-examination, humility, and penitence. You knelt, you whispered your transgressions, the priest offered absolution, and you left feeling lighter, in theory. But in practice, confession occasionally led to more sins than it purportedly forgave. Enter the confessor scandal, a genre of misbehavior so common it almost became a cliché. The setup was deceptively simple: one priest, many nuns, and an enclosed space specifically designed for private conversation about temptation. What indeed could possibly go wrong? Quite a lot, it turns out. Some confessors took their spiritual duties seriously. Others interpreted ministering to the soul as an open invitation to explore the rest of the nun's emotional terrain, especially if she was young, anxious, or from a wealthy family whose influence might protect them both. Boundaries were porous, the confessional curtains were thick, and ecclesiastical supervision was mostly theoretical. In one infamous case, Father Anselm of Tours heard the confessions of 30 nuns and somehow managed to develop special spiritual intimacy with 10 of them. The abbess began to suspect something when Sister Magdalene emerged from confession giggling and smelling faintly of clove wine. Reports of impropriety trickled in from across Europe. Some confessors were caught meeting nuns at odd hours. Others received love letters cunningly disguised as theological questions. One was famously discovered with his hand on a novice's knee, claiming he was checking her for signs of demonic possession, creative at least. The church's response? Delicate silence, followed by convenient reassignment. A confessor accused of misconduct was usually sent to another diocese to reflect, which in medieval terms meant, do it somewhere else and try not to get caught this time. Meanwhile, the nuns were left in awkward positions. Some were shamed, others were blamed entirely, accused of seducing the priest with feminine charm, which in many cases simply meant existing while under 30. A few even refused to confess again at all, choosing silence over perceived sanctity. Of course, not every confession spiraled into scandal, but the inherent setup, male authority, female submission, and secret conversations, was practically an open invitation to abuse, especially when wrapped in incense and Latin. Not all convent mischief involved flesh and desire. Some of it manifested as suspiciously helpful nuns with access to plants that could either alleviate a headache or, more controversially, terminate a pregnancy. Nearly every convent maintained a meticulously cultivated herb garden. It was an integral part of daily monastic life. Nuns meticulously prepared balms, tinctures, and herbal remedies for ailments ranging from common stomach aches to alleged demonic possession, though success with the latter was often mixed. But in some communities, these humble healers transformed into veritable convent chemists, and the fine line between legitimate medicine and deliberate mischief began to blur. They became known as the apothecary sisters, and they understood their plants remarkably well, perhaps too well in some cases. Many were trained in the discreet use of abortive herbs like pennyroyal, tansy, and rue, which were subtly employed to restore irregular cycles. Of course, the official explanation was always vaguely phrased. The potion was for a nervous condition or a stubborn humoral imbalance. But everyone implicitly understood what it meant when a nun visited the herbarium after whispering with a red face and a shaky voice. Some convents quietly gained a reputation as safe havens for women with delicate problems. A noble woman with an inconvenient pregnancy might suddenly decide to pursue a spiritual retreat and emerge 2 months later looking oddly slimmer and far more devout. Sister Hildegard of Trier was particularly famous, described in records as an herbalist of great discretion. According to one very nervous male witness, her concoctions could calm a restless body, silence an inconvenient cough, or undo what the flesh hath done. You had to admire the poetic phrasing. Of course, the church did not officially approve, but as long as things remained quiet and the patients left looking grateful rather than pregnant, few bishops asked questions. It was easier to assume the sisters were simply very good at tea. That said, there were darker rumors, stories of potions slipped into wine or love spells crafted with hair and bone. Most were likely exaggerated, but some convents did face inquiries for harboring witch-like tendencies, which in 15th century Europe was not the sort of review you wanted from your local inquisitor. For most medieval nuns, public exposure was a profound spiritual hazard, but for some it became a legal necessity, especially when their private transgressions blossomed into public litigation. Across Europe, convents occasionally found themselves dragged into secular courts. The causes varied: inheritance disputes, dowry claims, property feuds, and more awkwardly, cases involving illicit affairs, hidden pregnancies, and behavior that was demonstrably not befitting a bride of Christ. That last phrase appeared frequently. It was medieval legal code for someone's been up to something. One particularly spectacular case emerged from Florence, where a nun named Sister Costanza sued a priest for breach of promise. She alleged that he had seduced her in the confessional, promised to leave the priesthood, and then, tragically, didn't. She provided compelling evidence, letters, witnesses, and a very pointed poem. The court was so flustered that it delayed judgment for 3 years, desperately hoping everyone involved would either die or take permanent vows of silence. Another case in Cologne saw an abbess accused of misusing convent funds to purchase luxury linens, spiced wine, and gifts for visitors. The visitors, it turned out, were male, under 30, and unusually well-groomed for pilgrims. The trial records read like an expense report for a high-end inn. The abbess claimed the items were for spiritual hospitality. The court disagreed. Sometimes the church tried to keep matters internal. Canon law was supposedly sufficient to handle naughty nuns. But when crimes spilled over into civil territory, like theft, child abandonment, or contractual fraud, secular judges had to step in. And they were often unprepared for veiled women quoting scripture while denying everything with holy indignation. One nun in Burgundy was charged with attacking another nun over a man. During questioning, she claimed she had been possessed by jealousy and possibly by the devil. A 2-for-1 defense that remarkably secured her reduced penance and a convenient relocation. These courtroom dramas were usually suppressed as quickly as possible. The church didn't enjoy broadcasting its internal soap operas. But word always got out. Local taverns would buzz with phrases like, "Did you hear about the nun with the wine bill?" Or, "She brought her dowry and her boyfriend to court." In a world where few could read and fewer could fact-check, relics were the medieval equivalent of verified badges, and some convents collected them with all the restraint of a modern teenager at a clearance sale. Holy bones, scraps of cloth, drops of saintly blood, these items drew pilgrims, donations, and significant prestige. For many nuns, relics were sacred connections to heaven. For others, they were more like revenue streams. Take Abbess Euphemia of Thuringia, who boldly claimed her convent housed a piece of Mary Magdalene's hairbrush. Not a splinter of the true cross, not a veil fragment, but a grooming tool from the most misunderstood woman in Scripture. Euphemia described it as heaven-scented and encouraged visiting pilgrims to kneel before it and leave coins. The bishop, upon inspection, discovered it was almost certainly a comb from a local merchant and smelled faintly of rosemary and goat. Then there's the convent in Bruges that proudly displayed the fingernail of Saint Apollonia, patron saint of toothaches. When scholars later examined it, they found it was in fact a sliver of cow horn. The abbess insisted the miracle came not from the relic itself, but from faith in its idea, a bold theological pivot, to say the least. Some nuns became quite creative. One claimed to possess a handkerchief used by the Virgin Mary, still damp with tears, centuries later. Another swore she owned a thorn from the crown of thorns, despite living in a convent located hundreds of miles from any known trade route. When asked how she acquired it, she simply smiled and said, "The Lord provides." To be fair, not all these relics were outright fakes. Some were genuinely ancient, mysterious, and possibly holy. But the sheer volume of relics claimed by convents, including 6 different skulls of John the Baptist and 3 navels of Christ, strongly suggests that enthusiasm occasionally outpaced accuracy. Still, relics worked. Pilgrims came, coins clinked, and convents that couldn't attract visitors with sermons found that bones, real or not, were excellent marketing. Behind the convent walls, it wasn't all rosaries and fervent repentance. Some nuns were effectively running sophisticated soft power empires, conducting correspondence, meticulously managing vast tracts of land, and cunningly outmaneuvering bishops, all while pretending to care deeply about embroidery. These weren't your average sisters. They were abbesses, often from noble families, and they understood something crucial about medieval life. Influence wasn't sinful if you cleverly rebranded it as stewardship. Take Abbess Matilda of Essen, who effectively managed her abbey like a duchy. She negotiated complex land deals, hosted royal guests, and once publicly corrected a visiting count's Latin. She was revered as both pious and terrifying, a powerful combination that allowed her to accomplish significant feats while technically never leaving the cloister. Many convents controlled vast estates. The church may have frowned on women openly wielding authority, but it had no problem accepting their substantial taxes. That left abbesses and senior nuns in charge of intricate finances, extensive agriculture, and persistent disputes with tenant farmers. And like any astute landowner, they sometimes bribed local officials, forged a deed or two, and encouraged favorable tithes through well-timed blessings. One convent in Normandy famously negotiated its own treaty with a rival monastery after a dispute over fishing rights escalated into a full-blown holy turf war. The abbess at the time, Sister Julianne, penned a peace letter described by scholars as unusually sharp for a woman sworn to humility. Translation: she absolutely roasted the abbot in flawless Latin. Then there was the political matchmaking. Noble families frequently installed their daughters in convents, not always out of sincere piety, but for strategic placement. A nun from the right lineage could serve as a de facto family agent, passing along sensitive information, lobbying quietly, or even strategically delaying papal decisions with conveniently lost letters. Some convents secretly harbored spies, some employed lawyers. One German abbey reportedly employed a scribe who also happened to be skilled in fencing, which strongly suggests their copy editing process was particularly intense. Of course, the church noticed and occasionally attempted to crack down, but as long as the sisters remained outwardly devout, there was little the hierarchy could effectively do. You can't excommunicate someone for being too competent, even if they're clearly running the place like a velvet-gloved mafia. By the late Middle Ages, some convents had evolved into something resembling self-contained cities, complete with their own economies, internal hierarchies, bustling gossip networks, carefully guarded secrets, and yes, the occasional underground baby swap. Not all scandals wore a sultry smile or left behind a pile of incriminating love letters. Some were cloaked in profound silence, not the holy kind, but the strategic kind. The kind of silence that meticulously kept reputations intact, that covered up the muffled crying, the sudden sight of blood, the mysterious illness of a nun who mysteriously vanished and whose cell was given to a new novice the very next morning, accompanied by a polite note of mourning. Because sometimes scandal wasn't loud, it was chillingly procedural. Take the case of Abbess Theodora, who governed her convent like a medieval CEO. She managed vast lands, hosted powerful dukes, and held prayer vigils so elaborate they required detailed seating charts. When 3 of her novices turned up pregnant over the span of a single year, she insisted it was the result of spiritual temptation and ordered stricter fasting for everyone but herself. When local clerics dared to raise questions, she promptly accused them of envy and threatened to withhold intercessory prayer for their souls. A chillingly bold move, even for the 14th century. Other convents simply leaned into their notoriety. The Abbey of St. Lucilla, outside Milan, quietly gained a reputation as a refuge for reformed women, a vague term that generally meant former courtesans who now spent 20% of their day in prayer and 80% in expensive robes. They hosted lavish musical recitals, charged admission for elaborate feast day processions, and famously kept peacocks, actual live peacocks, strutting elegantly in their garden. The bishop dismissed them as a minor concern. Rome, however, astutely recognized them as profitable. In England, one nun was so exceptionally skilled at forging indulgences that her fake scrolls made it all the way to York Cathedral, where they were blessed by a bishop before anyone realized they were printed using ink mixed with berry wine. Even the devout weren't immune to strange practices. One mystic nun claimed she experienced spiritual visions only when fasting and dancing simultaneously. Her superior eventually banned both activities, prompting her to invent holy spinning. Visitors thought she was possessed. She insisted she was simply expressing divine joy at 30 revolutions per minute. Because beneath the incense in scripture, there was always something else. Raw, stubborn life, relentlessly clawing its way through the cracks in the marble. Before he was the world's most legendary barrel-dwelling philosopher, Diogenes was just the son of a banker in the Greek city of Sinope. That's right, the man who would later scoff at gold and publicly spit on wealth was literally born into money, though that didn't last long. Diogenes' life took a dramatic turn when he and his father, Hesychius, were implicated in a rather creative crime, defacing the local currency. Not metaphorically, they were accused of literally tampering with the coins, possibly shaving them down or forging them. It's still debated whether Diogenes knew precisely what he was doing, or if he was simply helping his dad with the family business. But one thing is clear, the local authorities were not amused, and so, the future cynic was promptly exiled. Now for most people, being exiled from their hometown would be a profound tragedy. For Diogenes, it was a career move. He fled to Athens, the philosophical epicenter of the Greek world, and decided that instead of desperately trying to crawl back into respectable society, he would methodically dismantle it, bit by bit, with cutting sarcasm, a razor-sharp tongue, and a complete disregard for pants. Athens at the time was teeming with prestigious thinkers and polished sophists: Plato, Aristotle, the whole academic gang. Diogenes, penniless and technically homeless, simply didn't care. While others debated metaphysics in flowing linen robes, he rolled into town with a dog-like grin and a singular mission: expose every shred of hypocrisy he could sniff out. And yes, dog-like isn't a metaphor. He embraced it. In fact, he proudly identified with the word kynikos, meaning dog-like in Greek, which is precisely where we get the word cynic, barking at corruption, biting at convention, and licking truth raw and unfiltered. His first order of business, completely ditching all societal pretense. He famously renounced possessions, openly mocked conventional manners, and slept in a giant ceramic jar, often mistakenly called a barrel, like a philosophical raccoon. It was his ultimate statement: if society was a facade, he was going to live explicitly outside of it, literally. This wasn't merely rebellion for rebellion's sake. Diogenes genuinely believed that true virtue originated from living in accordance with nature, and nature, he argued, didn't require money, a grand reputation, or sprawling 10-room villas. It simply demanded honesty, and perhaps a sturdy jar. If Athens was considered the heart of philosophical prestige, then Plato was its undisputed golden child, polished, revered, and to Diogenes' taste, entirely too serious. While Plato was meticulously categorizing virtues and defining abstract ideals, Diogenes was, well, metaphorically and literally, peeing on them. One of the most famous anecdotes involves Plato attempting to define a human being as a featherless biped. He believed it was a clever, concise summary of our species. Diogenes, always ready to weaponize mockery, promptly plucked a chicken and brought it into the academy, loudly declaring, "Behold, Plato's human." The joke landed with such force that Plato was compelled to revise his definition by adding, "with broad, flat nails." Score 1 for the man in the jar. But Diogenes wasn't just trolling for attention. He genuinely believed that philosophers like Plato had become too consumed by abstract nonsense, forgetting the crucial importance of living with genuine integrity. To Diogenes, virtue wasn't something to be endlessly debated, it was something to be lived. And if that meant heckling the intellectual elite while munching on raw onions and appearing homeless, then so be it. He made a habit of disrupting Plato's lectures, often walking through the crowds with a lantern in broad daylight, muttering that he was looking for an honest man. The crowd laughed nervously, because deep down they knew he was right. Athens, for all its democratic ideals and magnificent marble buildings, had become a place of polite lies and performative philosophical discourse. Diogenes tore through it with blunt, disarming honesty. Plato reportedly called Diogenes Socrates gone mad, and that wasn't entirely inaccurate. Like Socrates, Diogenes posed uncomfortable questions and resolutely refused to conform to societal rules. But unlike Socrates, Diogenes didn't seek a dialogue. He craved a spectacle, and he was more than happy to play the role of the clown if it meant powerfully revealing hypocrisy. He made the simple life appear outrageously unconventional. He begged without shame, ate whatever scraps he could scavenge, and relieved himself wherever he pleased, often to the profound horror of onlookers. But each action, however crude, was a deliberate philosophical statement. Why should he feel shame for natural bodily functions when others felt no shame for lying, cheating, and hoarding immense wealth? Where Plato meticulously constructed ideal worlds, Diogenes furiously smashed the illusions of this one. And if you had asked him, that made him the true philosopher, even if he did smell a bit like old olives and existential dread. By now, Diogenes had become a full-time philosophical menace. He had no permanent address, unless you count the massive ceramic jar he slept in, tucked away in the bustling marketplace like some kind of sentient street art installation. He owned almost nothing, just a cloak, a stick, and a simple cup, until he observed a boy drinking water directly from his cupped hands and promptly threw his own cup away. "A child has beaten me in plainness of living," he declared. That was the defining characteristic of Diogenes. He didn't just talk about simplicity, he out-simplified everyone. He wasn't pretending to reject wealth while secretly hoarding silver under his mattress. No, he quite literally lived off scraps, bathed in rainwater, and slept among the dogs. In fact, he often proudly called himself a dog, not as a self-insult, but as a badge of honor. Dogs, he argued, live naturally, without shame, pretense, or obsessive concern with status. And that's precisely how Diogenes wanted to live, barking included. Then there was the lamp, or lantern depending on the translation, which he famously carried during the day. "What are you doing?" people would ask, perplexed. "Looking for an honest man," he'd grumble. Of course, the subtext was perfectly clear. He wasn't finding one. He wasn't even hopeful. The joke was the very point. A searing slap in the face to everyone who considered themselves virtuous while living lives dripping in compromise. His daily life became a continuous performance art piece, and every gesture was a lesson. When he was once caught masturbating in public, he reportedly quipped, "If only it were as easy to relieve hunger by rubbing my stomach." Crude? Absolutely. But for Diogenes, natural acts weren't shameful. Hypocrisy was. And let's be clear, Diogenes wasn't poor because he had to be. He had offers of shelter, food, even patronage from wealthy admirers. He turned them down like someone expertly dodging a pyramid scheme. For him, accepting charity meant chaining himself to obligation. And Diogenes would not be leashed, not by money, not by decorum, and definitely not by society's awkward coughs when he did something uncivilized in public. He wasn't living on the fringe of society. He had deliberately planted himself there like a thorn, sharp, profoundly uncomfortable, and utterly impossible to ignore. If everyone else was busy polishing their masks, Diogenes was proudly displaying his dirt. And in a world utterly consumed by roles and rituals, that was the most radical act of all. One of the most iconic encounters in ancient philosophy, and quite possibly in all of history, occurred between the dirtiest man in Athens and the most powerful man on earth. Enter Alexander the Great, a young conqueror with the ego of a god and the military might to back it up. After hearing numerous stories about Diogenes, Alexander became intrigued. Here was a man who possessed nothing, desired nothing, feared nothing, and yet commanded widespread attention across the Greek world. Naturally, Alexander felt compelled to meet him. He found Diogenes lounging in his jar, sunbathing like a stray cat that just happened to be fluent in moral philosophy. The king of Macedon approached and famously asked the question, "Is there anything I can do for you?" And Diogenes, without even bothering to sit up, replied, "Yes, stand out of my sunlight, you meek drop." Alexander's entourage was horrified. This man had just dismissed the ruler of most of the known world like an annoying street vendor. But Alexander, remarkably, was impressed. According to legend, he turned to his men and declared, "If I were not Alexander, I would wish to be Diogenes." It's the kind of statement history professors love to quote and YouTube comment sections love to misattribute, but regardless of its exact historical accuracy, the moment perfectly captures the essence of Diogenes. In a world utterly obsessed with power, he was untouchable because he wanted absolutely nothing. He had no palace, no army, no grand reputation to protect. You cannot bribe a man who sleeps in a jar. You cannot blackmail a man who openly begs for food, and you definitely cannot impress a man who finds luxury laughable. What Diogenes taught Alexander and the wider world was that true power emanates from needing nothing and fearing no one. That was Diogenes' ultimate rebellion, not shouting in the streets, not urinating on social customs, but stripping life down to its barest essentials and daring anyone to call him poor. In a single, cutting sentence, he reduced one of history's greatest conquerors to merely a shadow blocking the sun. And unlike most philosophers, Diogenes didn't just preach this radical freedom. He lived it so completely that even emperors felt small in his presence. Now, imagine trying to impress your friends after that. Good luck. By now, Diogenes wasn't merely a local eccentric. He was the very embodiment of a new, radical way of thinking, cynicism. And not the watered-down version we casually use today when someone's simply being grumpy about politics. No, the original cynicism was feral, raw, and quite possibly carried fleas. Diogenes fundamentally believed that society had become rotten because it was built on a foundation of lies. Lies about happiness, lies about virtue, lies about success. People, he observed, spent their entire lives chasing fleeting wealth, desperately climbing social ladders, and stuffing their heads with abstract, meaningless nonsense. Diogenes took one look at all that and declared, "No thanks, I'd rather sleep in a pot and eat scraps." At its core, cynicism was about living in profound harmony with nature. That meant shedding all artificial needs, luxury, fame, political ambition, and returning to a life of utter simplicity and complete self-sufficiency. If nature didn't spontaneously hand you a golden goblet, then perhaps you didn't truly need one. And if nature gave you a stomach, then yes, openly begging for bread or brazenly stealing an onion was, in his view, far more honest than flattering a corrupt politician. His philosophy was also deeply confrontational. Diogenes didn't discreetly hide his beliefs in academic essays or temple scrolls. He lived them loudly, publicly. He openly mocked, vocally barked, and even physically interrupted people's lives to forcefully make them confront their own glaring contradictions. If someone preached virtue but lived lavishly, Diogenes would follow them around like a philosophical heckler, exposing the rot festering underneath the silk. To Diogenes, actions mattered infinitely more than abstract ideas. In fact, he once famously said, "Other dogs bite their enemies, I bite my friends to save them." Because nothing said friendship quite like a good metaphorical gnaw on the ankle of your cherished delusions. He was especially brutal toward hypocrisy, particularly among fellow philosophers. If a scholar claimed that poverty was noble while comfortably living in luxury, Diogenes would hold up a mirror, metaphorically or otherwise. He once saw a lavish temple being built and declared, "The gods must have gone blind if they need such a grand house." In a world obsessed with image, Diogenes was image's natural predator. Where others cloaked their ambitions in elaborate rhetoric, he stripped everything down, literally and figuratively. He wasn't trying to be liked, he was trying to awaken people. And if that meant barking like a dog or relieving himself on public statues, well, so be it. Truth, after all, wasn't always polite. Diogenes wasn't merely a philosopher, he was Athens' walking conscience, a filthy, loud, and extremely inconvenient one, depending on whom you asked. He was either a lunatic with questionable bowel control or the only sane man in a city overflowing with liars, perhaps both. He made a career out of offending people. Once, during a feast, he walked barefoot across the banquet hall's expensive carpet, ostentatiously wiping the mud from his feet and muttering, "Thus I trample on the pride of Plato." Not exactly RSVP-appropriate behavior, but for Diogenes, this was more than mere rudeness. It was a potent protest against vanity, excess, and all the hollow rituals people wrapped around themselves to feel important. He challenged everyone. When he saw a wealthy man donating to the poor just to be admired, Diogenes muttered, "That's not charity, that's investment." Another time, he saw a man getting angry at being slapped and calmly said, "You shouldn't be upset, it was just flesh striking flesh." This wasn't just philosophy, it was psychological judo. But the real genius of Diogenes wasn't just in what he said, it was in how he lived. His daily existence was a living critique of everything people took for granted. He turned the world upside down and held it there, waiting to see what coins might fall out. Naturally, not everyone appreciated the free lessons. He was ridiculed, attacked, and even arrested, though trying to arrest a man with no possessions and no shame was like trying to confiscate smoke. In one city, after being captured and sold as a slave, yes, really, he calmly told the auctioneer, "Sell me to a man who needs a master. Let that sink in." He ended up with a Corinthian man named Xeniades, who didn't just buy Diogenes. He took him home and allowed him to run the household, educate the children, and essentially become a sarcastic live-in life coach. Somehow, Diogenes managed to transform slavery into a compelling lecture series. Whether insulting kings or mentoring children, Diogenes remained painfully consistent. He mocked all power structures, even ones he accidentally became a part of. If someone ever tried to praise him too much, he'd remind them that he was just a dog chasing truth and occasionally peeing on golden statues. He was society's permanent splinter. The more you tried to ignore him, the deeper he lodged into your conscience. To suggest Diogenes held strong opinions about social conventions would be like saying the sun is merely a bit warm. He didn't just reject polite customs, he launched a one-man war against them with the ferocity of a barefoot prophet and the questionable hygiene of a disobedient raccoon. Bathing? Overrated. Dining etiquette? Pointless. Shame? A tool used by cowards and hypocrites to hide behind marble columns. Diogenes profoundly believed that most societal norms weren't there to genuinely help people. They existed to control them, to shame them into conformity, and to conspicuously separate the powerful from the poor. So naturally, he decided to live in a way that defied every single one of them. He often walked around barefoot through broken streets, even in the depths of winter. When asked why he didn't wear shoes like a normal person, he famously replied, "If I were in need of shoes, I'd be more distressed about my life than my feet." Diogenes also had a knack for performing embarrassing bodily functions in public, and not out of ignorance. He knew exactly what he was doing. These acts weren't random, they were deliberate statements. He believed that if something was natural and necessary, it shouldn't be a source of shame. In other words, if you're going to scold me for burping but not for cheating your neighbor, then your moral compass, he would argue, is fundamentally broken. Even begging became a form of profound resistance. While most beggars tried to appeal to pity or social obligation, Diogenes treated it as a spiritual test for both himself and the person being asked. If they gave, fine. If not, that was fine too. Either way, he remained honest and hungry. But Diogenes wasn't just rebelling for rebellion's sake. His entire existence was an ongoing experiment to determine how little a person truly needed to live well. Not just survive, but live well with dignity, with freedom, with a sense of humor sharp enough to slice through the pomp of politicians and the polished language of philosophers. He exposed the absurdity of conventions by pointedly ignoring them entirely. And the more people insisted he behave normally, the more he doubled down, powerfully proving that many so-called civilized behaviors were really just rituals we performed to make ourselves feel superior. In a world that obsessed over masks, Diogenes was barefaced and probably barefoot, laughing in the sun, implicitly asking us why we weren't. Diogenes, of course, didn't leave behind memoirs, grand marble busts, or temples in his honor. He wouldn't have wanted them. In fact, if someone had attempted to build him a statue, he probably would have spat on it. His profound legacy lives not in what he created, but in what he relentlessly destroyed: illusions, pretensions, and bloated egos. As for his death, like everything else about Diogenes, it's shrouded in stories that are somewhere between tragic, ridiculous, and profoundly fitting. Some say he died from holding his breath, out of sheer boredom with life. Others claim he succumbed to an infected dog bite, an irony not lost on anyone familiar with his famous nickname. And then there's the version where he simply lay down, said nothing, and didn't get back up. No grand last words, no dramatic curtain call, just the world's loudest cynic slipping away silently, as if even death failed to impress him. When asked how he wished to be buried, Diogenes reportedly replied, "Throw me outside the city wall and let the beasts have me." Shocked, someone inquired if he was worried about animals tearing him apart. Diogenes coolly answered, "Not if you give me a stick to chase them away." "But you won't be able to use it," the man pointed out. "Then why should I care what happens to me when I'm dead?" Diogenes retorted. Mortality? Zero. In the centuries after his death, Diogenes' radical teachings didn't disappear. They spread like wildfire among those who were weary of hypocrisy. His unique brand of cynicism inspired an entire school of thought, profoundly influencing later Stoics like Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, who borrowed his core idea of self-sufficiency and virtue, untainted by wealth or reputation. Even today, in an age obsessed with filters, social media followers, and fleeting fortune, Diogenes still feels oddly relevant. He serves as a powerful reminder that true freedom isn't found in owning more, it's discovered in needing less. That dignity doesn't come from prestigious titles, but from living in absolute alignment with your values, even if those values include yelling at statues and residing in a barrel. He may have died penniless, homeless, and barefoot, but Diogenes left behind something far more durable than gold: the uncomfortable truth. The kind that embeds itself in your brain like a splinter and dares you to laugh at yourself, or at the very least, question why you're not carrying a lantern. You might assume a man who barked at citizens, slept in a jar, and publicly scolded Plato would be relegated to a forgotten footnote in philosophy. And yet, Diogenes has become a powerful symbol, not of madness, but of radical honesty in a world often built on illusion. The fact that we still discuss him over 2,000 years later says something profound. It says that deep down, people are still hungry for truth, even if it smells like onions and resides in a barrel. Diogenes matters today because his life was a fundamental provocation. He dared to ask, what happens when you stop playing along? What if you stop relentlessly chasing wealth, fleeting reputation, even basic comfort, and simply live with only what you truly need? Strip away all the performance, the polite lies, the carefully curated identities. What's left? According to Diogenes, what's left is real freedom. In a society built on image, whether ancient Athens or modern Instagram, his rejection of appearances resonates harder than ever. He didn't just question authority or wealth, he questioned the very need for them. That's why so many thinkers, from Stoics to anarchists to comedians, have drawn inspiration from him. He's the original minimalist, the spiritual grandfather of every "I quit my six-figure job to live in a van" story you see online. Even Diogenes' crudeness has a purpose. He used shock, not to merely offend, but to expose. He wanted people to feel the discomfort, because that's precisely where genuine reflection begins. If you're more disturbed by someone relieving themselves in public than you are by pervasive corruption in government or rampant greed in religion, then Diogenes would argue your priorities are fundamentally inverted. And while his methods were undeniably unconventional, the core message is timeless. Virtue is not something you buy, brand, or broadcast. It's how you live when no one's watching, or, in Diogenes' case, when literally everyone is watching and you just don't care. He reminds us that wisdom doesn't always wear flowing robes. Sometimes it shouts from a jar, laughs in your face, and stubbornly refuses to move out of your sunlight. In a world overflowing with noise, pervasive branding, and sheer nonsense, Diogenes invites us to be something refreshingly different, honest, unfiltered, and just a little bit dog-like. And maybe, just maybe, that's what makes him the wisest lunatic who ever lived. By the early 1870s, the northern plains were seething with palpable tension, a slow, grinding buildup of broken promises, blatant land theft, and devastating cultural collision. At the very heart of it was the Black Hills, a region profoundly sacred to the Lakota Sioux, who reverently called it Pahasapa. The U.S. government had formally recognized this territory as belonging to the Lakota in the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty. On paper, the land was theirs forever, but forever in this tragic case lasted only about 6 years. Everything irrevocably changed in 1874 when gold was sensationally discovered in the Black Hills by an expedition led by none other than George Armstrong Custer. Word quickly spread, and like flies to honey, thousands of prospectors poured into the region, flagrantly violating the treaty and desecrating sacred ground. The government, rather than enforcing its own solemn agreement, instead attempted to buy the land from the Lakota. They steadfastly refused. This wasn't merely about gold, it was about their very survival, their inherent sovereignty, and the relentless erosion of their traditional way of life. To Washington, the Lakota and their allies were now deemed hostiles. They weren't negotiating, they were actively resisting. The U.S. Army was explicitly ordered to bring all Native groups onto reservations by January 31, 1876. Any group that failed to comply would be treated as enemies. Many didn't even receive the message, scattered as they were across vast winter hunting grounds. Others simply refused. They had no intention of abandoning their freedom for a life of dependence and confinement. What was rapidly forming on the plains wasn't just a disagreement. It was an inevitable collision course. A loose alliance of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors, led by legendary figures like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, began to gather. They were not a formal army, but they were bound by a singular, profound purpose: to protect their land, their people, and their cherished way of life. They knew war was imminent. Meanwhile, U.S. military planners, supremely confident in their numbers and superior technology, dismissed the tribes as disorganized and divided. They couldn't have been more tragically wrong. The Plains warriors were highly mobile, intimately familiar with the terrain, and fiercely motivated by the deepest of causes. The powder keg was lit, the fuse was burning, and soon the clash that would become the Battle of Little Bighorn was hurtling toward its place in history. George Armstrong Custer was not your typical military officer. By 1876, he was a household name, a flamboyant, divisive Civil War hero with a reputation for audacious boldness, reckless decision-making, and a dangerous addiction to personal glory. With his flowing blonde hair, flashy uniforms, and insatiable appetite for headlines, Custer seemed more suited to a theatrical stage than a grim battlefield. And yet, his daring had earned him both grudging respect and bitter resentment. After the Civil War, Custer had been assigned to the western frontier as a lieutenant colonel in the 7th U.S. Cavalry. His job enforced federal Indian policy, which increasingly meant forcing native tribes onto reservations, peacefully if possible, violently if necessary. By 1876, Custer was eager for a fight. His political ambitions were simmering, and a decisive military victory could fully restore his tarnished reputation after a very public feud with President Ulysses S. Grant's administration. He wasn't just pursuing Native Americans, he was relentlessly chasing personal relevance. As tensions escalated with the Lakota and their allies, Custer was ordered to join a three-pronged campaign designed to locate and subdue the so-called hostiles. The plan was to encircle the native encampments and force them into submission. Custer's column would approach from the east, while General John Gibbon's troops came from the west, and General George Crook's forces advanced from the south. But from the very beginning, the plan suffered from a dangerous mix of overconfidence and abysmal coordination. The terrain was rugged, the distances vast, and the intelligence shaky at best. Most U.S. officers, including Custer, genuinely believed they were facing a small, scattered group of warriors. They had absolutely no idea that thousands of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho had come together for a massive summer gathering near the Little Bighorn River, the largest native force ever assembled on the plains. Custer, as usual, desperately wanted to strike quickly and claim all the glory for himself. He declined crucial reinforcements, refused to bring Gatling guns that would slow him down, and brazenly ignored orders to wait. Instead, he pushed ahead with his 600 men, recklessly splitting his forces into 3 battalions for a surprise attack. It was audacious, it was bold, and it was based on disastrously false assumptions. Because what lay ahead was not a broken village of stragglers, it was a unified, battle-hardened force, ready to fiercely defend its very way of life. And Custer, with his signature flair, was about to ride straight into legend and utter disaster. While the U.S. Army operated on faulty maps and even faultier assumptions, something extraordinary was rapidly unfolding along the banks of the Little Bighorn River. Thousands of Lakota Sioux, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho had gathered, not initially for war, but for a traditional summer encampment. It was a time to rest, to hunt, to hold sacred ceremonies, and to simply be together as families and allies. But the grim political reality of 1876 cast a long, ominous shadow over the gathering. The native leaders knew what was coming. They had witnessed the treaties repeatedly broken, the vast buffalo herds disappear, and the relentless encroachment of railroads and settlers. They understood that this encampment, peaceful as it seemed, might very soon transform into a battlefield, and they were not going to run. At the very center of this growing coalition was Sitting Bull, a Hunkpapa Lakota holy man and visionary leader. In the weeks leading up to the battle, he performed a powerful sun dance, a grueling ceremony of sacrifice and prayer. According to witnesses, Sitting Bull had a profound vision during the dance. He saw soldiers falling into the camp like grasshoppers, defeated and broken. For his devout followers, this was no mere metaphor, it was a chilling prophecy. And then there was Crazy Horse, a warrior of almost mythical skill and legendary bravery. Quiet, reclusive, and deeply committed to protecting his people, Crazy Horse had already earned a formidable reputation as a fearless leader in earlier battles. He would soon prove himself again, charging directly into enemy lines with a unique blend of daring and tactical brilliance. Other influential leaders, like Gall and Two Moons, also emerged as key voices. Though the tribes did not operate under a single, centralized command, their unity in this critical moment was truly remarkable. They were defending more than just land. They were fiercely defending freedom itself. Estimates vary, but there may have been 8,000 to 10,000 native people in the Little Bighorn Valley, including between 1,500 and 2,000 warriors. They were well armed, many with repeating rifles, and possessed a superior, intimate knowledge of the terrain. And most importantly, they were fighting for their homes, their families, and their very way of life. Custer had foolishly expected a few hundred desperate warriors. Instead, he was about to confront a formidable coalition, one born not just of resistance, but of spiritual resolve, ancestral duty, and the fierce, unyielding will to survive. The storm was gathering. On June 22nd, 1876, Custer and his 7th Cavalry departed the mouth of the Rosebud River, following tracks they believed would lead to a nearby native encampment. For 3 days, they moved relentlessly fast, pushing men and horses to the brink of exhaustion. Custer was utterly convinced the native village would scatter if they realized soldiers were approaching. He desperately wanted to strike first, strike hard, and claim all the glory before General Terry or Gibbon could arrive and steal his spotlight. But this intense urgency tragically blinded him to any semblance of caution. Scouts, including esteemed Crow and Arikara warriors, vehemently warned Custer that the village ahead was massive, unlike anything they had ever witnessed before. Some even ascended high ridges and returned with wide, frightened eyes, stating, "Too many to count." They urged Custer to wait, to reconsider. He did not. On the morning of June 25th, Custer reached a ridge overlooking the Little Bighorn Valley. From a distance, he could see parts of the vast encampment, teepees stretching along the river like a small city, smoke rising from cooking fires, children playing, horses grazing. But what he perceived as a vulnerable camp was, in chilling reality, a sleeping giant. Still believing he could surprise them, Custer made the fateful decision to divide his 600-man regiment. He dispatched Captain Frederick Benteen to scout to the south with 125 men. Major Marcus Reno was ordered to attack the southern end of the village with 140 men. Meanwhile, Custer himself took about 210 men northward, hoping to flank the village from behind and trap the warriors in a pincer movement. It was audacious, it was incredibly risky, and it was based on disastrously false assumptions. Custer did not know that the warriors were already well aware of the soldiers' approach. Lakota scouts had spotted dust trails and moving columns. The crucial element of surprise was lost before it ever truly began. As Reno's men descended into the valley, they didn't find panicked families fleeing. They found warriors assembling, more warriors than they had ever imagined. And instead of collapsing, the camp erupted into organized, furious resistance, led by the very people Custer had so arrogantly underestimated. At that precise moment, the myth of invincibility surrounding the U.S. Army began to crack. The 7th Cavalry was marching into a storm it couldn't possibly outrun, and Custer was leading the charge directly into its devastating heart. At around 3 p.m. on June 25th, 1876, Major Marcus Reno and his men charged the southern end of the native encampment. What they expected was chaos, women and children fleeing, warriors scrambling. What they encountered instead was an organized, furious resistance. Within minutes, the charge unraveled. Reno's men dismounted in the timber along the river and opened fire, but the sheer volume of returning fire shocked them. The warriors were not only numerous, they were aggressive, fast, and remarkably coordinated. Lakota and Cheyenne fighters surged across the open ground with terrifying speed, many on horseback, firing with deadly accuracy. Some carried Winchesters and Spencer repeating rifles, which were more advanced than the single-shot carbines the cavalry used. Reno panicked. Instead of holding his position, he gave a chaotic order to mount and retreat across the river. In the desperate scramble, many soldiers were shot down, some drowned. The retreat quickly devolved into a rout. Bloodied and utterly disorganized, Reno's men staggered up a bluff on the east side of the river, desperately trying to form a defensive position. Just then, Captain Frederick Benteen arrived from the south with reinforcements. Together, he and Reno established a rough perimeter atop what would later be called Reno Hill. There they dug in, low on water, surrounded and under constant fire. They could hear distant gunfire to the north, the ominous sound of Custer's own fate unfolding, but they didn't know exactly what was happening. They sent messengers, but none returned. Meanwhile, in the valley below, native warriors swarmed across the battlefield, emboldened by Reno's chaotic retreat. Spirits soared, the prophecy of Sitting Bull was coming true. The invaders were not invincible, they were fleeing, and more were arriving. Up until now, U.S. military campaigns on the plains had been predictable. Native groups had learned to expect overwhelming force, fast strikes, and harsh retaliation. But this was different. The warriors were fighting on their own terms, mobile, determined, fueled by vision and rage. And while Reno desperately clung to life on the hilltop, unsure of what had gone wrong, Custer was continuing his advance to the north, completely unaware that the entire tactical framework he relied on had already utterly collapsed. The battle was no longer about strategy. It had become a brutal fight for survival, and Custer's clock was ticking relentlessly. While Reno's forces were retreating in chaos and Benteen was fortifying Reno Hill, Custer and his 210 men pressed northward, entirely unaware of the true scale of the battle unfolding behind them. Still under the illusion that the village could be attacked from multiple directions, Custer's detachment moved along high ground, hoping to strike the village's rear. But the warriors knew he was coming. By now, the alarm had fully spread throughout the massive encampment. Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors, hundreds strong, surged toward Custer's column. Instead of finding panicked women and children to capture, Custer found himself facing a tidal wave of mounted fighters. His troops were stretched thin along the ridge lines and hills, desperately trying to hold defensive positions, but they were quickly surrounded. The precise sequence of the fight remains debated. There were no survivors from Custer's immediate command to tell the tale. But what is clear is that the 7th Cavalry was completely overwhelmed in a matter of hours. The native forces, led by warriors like Crazy Horse and Gall, outmaneuvered and outnumbered Custer's men. Their superior knowledge of the terrain and aggressive tactics shredded the cavalry's lines. The soldiers tried to make a final stand on what would later be called Last Stand Hill. Surrounded, out of ammunition, and with no escape, they fell. Some in small groups, some alone, some reportedly trying to shoot themselves rather than be captured. Native accounts described the battle as brutal and swift. It wasn't just a fight, it was a collapse. Custer was killed in the final moments, likely shot through the chest and head. He was found among a cluster of men, including his brothers Tom and Boston Custer. Nearly every soldier in his command was killed, over 200 men wiped out to the last. For the native warriors, it was a staggering and deeply emotional victory, but it wasn't celebrated with triumphalism. Some accounts describe mourning rather than cheering, an understanding that, while they had won this battle, the larger war was far from over. The U.S. Army would return, and this moment of glory would inevitably be met with vengeance. Still, for one day on the rolling hills of Montana, the unstoppable machine of westward expansion had faltered. And Custer, the bold commander relentlessly chasing legacy, had found it, not in conquest, but in annihilation. When the dust finally settled on the evening of June 25th, silence returned to the hills of the Little Bighorn. Fires smoldered, ammunition belts lay scattered, and over 200 soldiers of the 7th Cavalry lay dead, including George Armstrong Custer and nearly every officer under his direct command. The battlefield was littered with broken weapons, fallen horses, and the bodies of men who had never seen it coming. But the native victory, as complete as it was, came with a grim understanding. This was not the end. It was a spark. The U.S. government, humiliated and enraged, would not forgive what they would soon call a massacre. Back east, newspapers screamed headlines of Custer's last stand, casting him as a martyr and the native warriors as bloodthirsty aggressors. The context, the treaty violations, the gold rush into sacred lands, the defensive nature of the fight was conveniently erased from the national narrative. In the days that followed, native families mourned their own losses. Though victorious, they too had suffered casualties, and they knew the American response would be swift. Some leaders, including Sitting Bull, urged the people to move quickly. They dismantled the great encampment and scattered into smaller bands across the plains, preparing for the inevitable retaliation. It wasn't long before U.S. troops, reinforced and rearmed, descended on the region. The defeat at Little Bighorn only hardened Washington's resolve. Policies became harsher, treaties were torn apart, and more troops arrived. The goal was no longer negotiation. It was absolute domination. Sitting Bull eventually fled north to Canada to avoid capture, while Crazy Horse continued to fight for another year before being killed under suspicious circumstances in 1877. Many bands, starving and outgunned, were forced onto reservations, their freedom shattered. The battlefield itself was discovered by relief troops 2 days later. The scene they found was grim and haunting. Many soldiers had been stripped of their uniforms and equipment, a traditional warrior custom meant to deprive enemies of dignity. Some bodies were mutilated, others left untouched, depending on tribal customs and the intensity of the fighting. But no one could deny what had happened. Custer was gone, the 7th Cavalry was decimated, and for a fleeting moment, Native resistance had achieved the impossible. They had won. The Battle of Little Bighorn was more than just a military clash. It became a powerful symbol, warped and weaponized by history. For the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, it was a rare and hard-won victory against overwhelming odds. For the U.S. government and its citizens, it was a profound humiliation that demanded swift, merciless retribution. In the American imagination, the narrative was quickly twisted. Custer was transformed from a reckless glory chaser into a tragic hero, the valiant general who made a last stand. The complexity of his decisions, the arrogance of his tactics, and the injustice of the U.S. invasion into treaty-protected lands were all swept under a wave of patriotic mythology. The press labeled the Native victory a massacre, conveniently erasing the fact that it was a defensive battle on Native land. But among Native communities, the battle was remembered very differently. It was a moment of unity, bravery, and prophecy fulfilled. The great encampment at the Little Bighorn represented a final, shining moment of freedom before the long shadow of reservation life closed in. For many, the battle became a point of profound pride, a testament to resistance and resilience. It proved that the indigenous peoples of the plains were not passive victims, but active defenders of their world. Yet the cost of that victory came swiftly. Within months, military campaigns intensified. The buffalo herds, already devastated, were deliberately targeted to destroy the native food supply. Tribes were relentlessly pursued. By 1877, Crazy Horse was dead. Sitting Bull would survive longer, but even he would eventually be killed in 1890, days before the Wounded Knee Massacre, another tragic milestone in the erasure of native sovereignty. And so the legacy of Little Bighorn became twofold, a source of inspiration and deep mourning. It exposed the cruelty of U.S. expansion, the broken promises, and the ferocity of a people who refused to be quietly erased. Today, the battlefield stands as a national memorial. For years, it honored only Custer and his men, but more recently, memorials have been added to honor the native warriors who fought and died there, not as villains, but as heroes defending their homelands. The hills remember both sides, the wind carries both songs, and the legacy of Little Bighorn still speaks, if you're willing to listen to more than one version of history. In the grand arc of American history, the Battle of Little Bighorn stands out as one of those rare moments when the underdog didn't just fight back, they won. For a single day, in 1876, native warriors held back the tide of an empire. They didn't win by sheer numbers, superior technology, or immense wealth. They won with courage, profound unity, and an unshakable will to protect their way of life. But the tragedy of Little Bighorn is that this victory did not ultimately change the long-term outcome of history. It only delayed it. In fact, it arguably accelerated the end. The stunning defeat of Custer enraged Washington. Public opinion hardened. Sympathy for native grievances, where it had existed, was buried under waves of vengeance and nationalism. Congress significantly increased military funding, and the campaign against the Plains tribes intensified with brutal precision. Within just a few years, the nomadic life that had defined Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho culture for centuries was gone. The buffalo were nearly extinct, the reservations were carved up, and the land was parceled out. The very hills that had once echoed with thundering hooves and fierce war cries now stood eerily silent. And yet Little Bighorn refused to fade. Over the decades, it has been reinterpreted, reimagined, and reclaimed. For many Americans, it started as a tale of heroic sacrifice. For others, it gradually became a powerful symbol of injustice, of a nation that broke its word and labeled resistance as treason. Today, the site is one of the few battlefields where both sides are remembered, where the markers don't all point in one direction. For Native peoples, the battle remains deeply symbolic, not as the beginning of defeat, but as the final brilliant stand of a free people, a moment when everything that was being taken from them, land, freedom, dignity, was fought for with every ounce of spirit they had left. It was, and still is, a sacred memory. And for the rest of us, Little Bighorn offers a difficult but necessary lesson about power, about myth, and about the immense cost of conquest. It reminds us that history is not always told solely by the victors. Sometimes it's buried beneath them, waiting to be unearthed. In the end, Custer may have gotten the immediate glory, but the warriors of Little Bighorn achieved something far more lasting: the truth and the undeniable right to declare, "We were here and we fought." The Forbidden City wasn't just built. It was conjured into existence with immense ambition, relentless labor, and a deep, unwavering desire for control. In 1406, the Yongle Emperor of the Ming Dynasty ordered the construction of a new imperial palace in Beijing, aiming to move the capital from Nanjing. But this was not going to be any ordinary palace. It would become the very heart of the Chinese Empire, a fortified city within a city, where no one entered unless explicitly summoned, and no secrets left its crimson walls unfiltered. Over the next 14 years, more than 1 million laborers, skilled craftsmen, and engineers toiled to complete this enormous undertaking. The materials alone were sourced from every corner of the vast empire: golden Nanmu wood from Sichuan, colossal marble blocks laboriously hauled across frozen rivers, and millions of perfectly glazed roof tiles baked to absolute perfection. Brick by painstaking brick, an empire's pride was meticulously set in stone. When finally completed, the Forbidden City covered nearly 180 acres and housed over 900 buildings. Its layout rigorously followed strict Confucian principles: symmetrical, orderly, hierarchical. At its core lay the Hall of Supreme Harmony, where emperors were crowned and imperial decrees thundered through the bureaucracy. But beyond the sheer grandeur, its deeper purpose was psychological. This wasn't merely a residence, it was a powerful statement. The emperor, it declared, does not live among you, he lives above you. And make no mistake, it was truly forbidden. The average citizen of Beijing never once stepped foot inside. Even high officials entered only by explicit imperial permission. Guards stood at every gate, and spies lurked in every corridor. The outer city bustled with vibrant markets and common life, but inside the red walls, time slowed, and strict ceremony rigidly ruled. It was a world locked in intricate ritual, cloaked in profound mystery, and insulated from the messy realities of daily life. But beneath its golden rooftops and crimson columns, the Forbidden City was also a simmering pressure cooker. For all its breathtaking beauty, it was built to isolate, to keep power fiercely centralized, to shield the emperor from perceived threats, both physical and political. In time, it would become a place of intricate intrigue, bitter betrayal, and hushed whispers in the shadows. A palace, yes, but also a grand stage for 5 centuries of imperial ambition and slow, inevitable unraveling. From the outside it dazzled, from the inside it watched, and it never, ever forgot who walked its hallowed halls. At the very heart of the Forbidden City sat the Emperor, the Son of Heaven, the living bridge between the mortal realm and the divine. But for all his cosmic authority, the man on the throne often led a life of extraordinary isolation. The Forbidden City didn't just protect the Emperor, it effectively consumed him. Every single day of his life was meticulously scripted with suffocating precision. He awoke to music, was dressed by attendants, and followed a schedule so ritualized it bordered on theatrical performance. Meals were sampled for poison, and documents were read aloud by ministers kneeling before him. Even a simple stroll through the gardens required ceremonial clearance and multiple escorts. Nothing was spontaneous. Everything was meticulously watched. And while the emperor sat at the absolute top of the hierarchy, he was far from truly free. The very structure that elevated him also, paradoxically, imprisoned him. Surrounded by layers of eunuchs, ministers, consorts, and spies, the emperor rarely encountered the outside world. His information was always filtered, his interactions meticulously managed, and his ability to act independently, especially in later dynasties, was often stifled by the overwhelming machinery of court protocol. Some emperors handled this with ruthless efficiency, like Yongle or Kangxi, who ruled with a firm hand and masterfully navigated the bureaucracy. Others succumbed to paranoia, decadence, or profound detachment, becoming lost in their own palace like a gilded ghost. There were emperors who spent months, even years, within the Forbidden City without ever setting foot outside its colossal walls. The world they ostensibly ruled might as well have been on the moon. Even within the palace, access to the emperor was tightly controlled. High-ranking officials could wait days for an audience. Family members had limited contact, and heaven helped the servant who crossed the wrong threshold. Protocol dictated precisely where you could stand, how you bowed, and even what you were permitted to see. In theory, the emperor could command legions with a single word. In practice, he often struggled to know whom to trust or what was truly transpiring beyond his confining walls. The throne might have been carved from jade and set above dragons, but it was also perpetually surrounded by curtains, layers upon layers of secrecy, and rigid ceremony. The Forbidden City crowned its emperor in gold, but it also wrapped him in profound silence. Behind every throne in the Forbidden City stood an invisible army, not of generals or ministers, but of eunuchs, castrated men who served within the palace. Eunuchs began as humble servants, but evolved into some of the most powerful and feared figures in imperial China. In a world where women were cloistered and men were potential threats, eunuchs occupied a strange middle space, intimate with the emperor, yet politically useful because they could never father rival dynasties. At first, their duties were simple: managing palace chores, delivering messages, caring for imperial robes. But as the emperors became increasingly secluded, especially during the Ming and Qing dynasties, eunuchs began to fill the power vacuum. They controlled crucial access to the emperor, meticulously filtered information, and eventually took over administrative functions entirely. Some wielded more power than generals. Others had the emperor's ear in ways even his own family couldn't achieve. And with power came relentless ambition and rampant corruption. The history of eunuchs in the Forbidden City is a constant cycle of rise and ruin. For every loyal servant, there was a schemer manipulating imperial decisions, silencing opponents, and hoarding immense wealth. Some eunuchs, like Wei Zhongxian during the late Ming period, effectively ran the empire from behind silk screens. His enemies mysteriously disappeared, his allies were swiftly promoted, and entire ministries lived in palpable fear of his whispers. But the influence of eunuchs wasn't just political, it was deeply personal. They cared for the emperor since childhood, watched him grow, and often became surrogate fathers, trusted mentors, or dangerous enablers. Their presence was constant in the emperor's chambers, his study, his court. If the emperor was lonely, it was often the eunuchs who knew and sometimes exploited that loneliness. Yet their lives were far from luxurious. Many were forcibly castrated as boys, often from poor families, hoping to secure them a future inside the palace. Those who survived the brutal operation and years of menial work could, with cunning and luck, rise in rank. But they were always viewed with deep suspicion by Confucian scholars and military elites, tolerated, used, and eventually scapegoated when things went wrong. In a city built on ceremony and profound secrecy, the eunuchs were the silent hands that moved the pieces. Not kings, not mere pawns, but something far more complicated and infinitely more dangerous. Beyond the grand halls and towering gates of the Forbidden City lay its most secretive zone, the inner court. This was the emperor's private world, a sprawling maze of palaces, tranquil gardens, and intimate sleeping chambers, hidden deep behind the imposing red walls. Here, the demanding business of state gave way to the far more personal business of dynasty, consorts, concubines, and children. And here, politics took on a new, more intimate and often ruthless form, one where beauty, intense jealousy, and intricate bloodlines rigidly ruled the game. The inner court was formally divided into 3 main palaces for the emperor's personal use and 6 designated residences for the empress and concubines. But don't be misled by the serene names and fragrant gardens. This was emphatically not a peaceful retreat. It was a constant battlefield, with dozens, sometimes hundreds, of women fiercely competing for the emperor's favor. The inner court was a world of veiled threats, whispered alliances, and calculated ambition. At the very top stood the empress, the legal wife of the emperor. She commanded rank and held ceremonial authority, but not always his genuine affection. The emperor's heart and his crucial heirs often came from the concubines, whose status could rise or fall overnight depending on a fleeting glance, a successful pregnancy, or a single damaging rumor. Some bore sons and were elevated to immense power. Others tragically faded into obscurity, their names forgotten, their futures quietly erased. Palace maids and senior eunuchs acted as intermediaries, messengers, and frequently as covert spies. Nothing happened without being seen. Nothing was forgotten. The women of the court had little explicit freedom, but they wielded significant influence in subtler ways, through charm, careful manipulation, and sometimes even poison. Occasionally, a consort would gain such profound favor that she effectively ruled through the emperor. One of the most famous was Empress Dowager Cixi, who rose from a low-ranking concubine to become the virtual ruler of China for nearly half a century. Her immense power began inside these very walls, behind closed doors in silken robes, with a brilliant mind cloaked in patience. To outsiders, the inner court appeared silent and perfumed, a place of art, music, and refined elegance. But behind the latticed windows and painted screens, it was a volatile pressure chamber where status, survival, and crucial lineage relentlessly collided. In the Forbidden City, power did not only march in boots and imperial robes. Sometimes it tiptoed through moonlit corridors and embroidered slippers, smiling sweetly, waiting to strike. Inside the Forbidden City, every gesture carried profound meaning, every step, every bow, every offering of incense. Nothing was done casually. This wasn't just a palace, it was a divine machine, meticulously designed for cosmic order. And the emperor wasn't just a man, he was the son of heaven, the sacred bridge between the earthly realm and the celestial. That meant every movement he made had immense cosmic weight. It wasn't just about secular power, it was about maintaining universal order. Each morning, officials lined up at the Meridian Gate long before sunrise, patiently waiting for the morning court audience. These sessions were brief and highly choreographed. Ministers knelt, spoke only when explicitly spoken to, and delivered their memorials with a practiced humility. Outside the palace, they were powerful men. Inside, they were mere shadows at the emperor's feet. One of the grandest rituals was the winter solstice ceremony, where the emperor offered solemn sacrifices at the temple of heaven to ensure harmony between heaven and earth. These rituals weren't optional. They were political theater on a sacred scale. A failed ritual, unexpected bad weather, or a forgotten step was interpreted as a grave sign that the mandate of heaven might be weakening. Inside the palace, rigid rituals governed every aspect of life: weddings, funerals, births, even meals. The emperor's food was inspected by multiple officials, tasted for poison, and arranged according to strict traditions. If the emperor dared to change the menu without permission, chaos could ripple through the kitchens and court alike. But perhaps the most telling ritual was silence. You didn't speak to the emperor unless spoken to. You didn't dare look him directly in the eye. Even his immediate family bowed, rose, and retreated backward. Distance was mandatory. Intimacy was rare. Over time, this obsession with ritual became a double-edged sword. On one hand, it meticulously preserved continuity, structure, and legitimacy across centuries. On the other, it paralyzed crucial decision-making. Ministers debated rigid protocol while the world outside changed dramatically. Foreign powers advanced, revolutions stirred. But inside the Forbidden City, the officials were still arguing about the proper number of ceremonial steps for a royal procession. The very rituals that had once cemented power began to calcify it. They kept the empire spinning, but also stuck firmly in place, like a beautifully painted clock whose hands no longer moved. Inside those golden walls, the performance continued, flawless, precise, and increasingly irrelevant. Beneath the lacquered beams and golden tiles of the Forbidden City lay a world not visible in paintings, a world of shadows, whispers, and endless suspicion. Though the formidable walls kept external enemies out, they utterly failed to contain internal ambition. And in a palace where power was highly concentrated, often inherited and frequently unstable, the greatest dangers weren't armies at the gates. They were the seemingly humble servants in your own chamber. Spying was not just common, it was deeply institutionalized. Eunuchs reported to other eunuchs. Palace maids gossiped in coded whispers. Even concubines employed informants, bribing or blackmailing lower servants for crucial information about their rivals. The emperor's word was law, but most of the time he didn't know which words to trust. paranoia was routine. Letters were discreetly opened, conversations were overheard, and an offhand remark could be twisted into treason. False accusations flourished. Ministers might rise to glory one day and be exiled the next, based on a single whisper. Families disappeared overnight. Some chose suicide over trial, fully understanding the grim fate that awaited them if they resisted. The eunuchs were both active participants and zealous enforcers of this invisible war. While some were loyal and protective of the emperor, others built vast spy networks that rivaled secret police organizations. Under the Ming dynasty, the infamous Eastern Depot, a eunuch-run intelligence agency, was granted terrifying power: the ability to arrest, interrogate, and execute without consulting the civil government. Torture was standard. Confessions were extracted like teeth. And while court scholars and officials deeply resented the eunuch's pervasive influence, they weren't above intrigue themselves. The court was a complex chessboard, and every promotion, every marriage alliance, every imperial edict was a calculated move in an endless, ruthless game. At times, even the emperor himself was a mere pawn, especially if he was young, sickly, or simply uninterested in ruling. Regents and dowagers pulled the strings, smiling in daylight and striking by night. It was a world where success demanded profound silence, cunning, and an impeccable memory for allegiances. One misstep, even an unguarded look, could prove fatal. And yet, people continued to scheme, because in the Forbidden City there was no higher prize than proximity to the throne, and no deeper fall than losing it. Beneath the rigid rituals and crimson walls was a city that never truly slept. It only watched and waited. The Forbidden City may have appeared eternal, its golden roofs gleaming in the sun, its red walls seemingly unshaken by the passage of time. But inside, dynasties rose and crumbled with alarming frequency. Power that appeared divine from a distance often proved to be dangerously mortal up close. And sometimes the empire didn't fall on a dramatic battlefield. It fell in a quiet corridor, behind a locked door, whispered out of existence by those closest to the throne. The Ming dynasty, which originally built the Forbidden City, ruled for nearly 3 centuries, but by the 1600s, it was staggering under the immense weight of its own bloated bureaucracy, rampant internal corruption, and widespread peasant uprisings. The palace had become a maze of ceremonial obsessions and overwhelming eunuch dominance, while famine and widespread unrest fermented outside its walls. In 1644, as rebel armies closed in on Beijing, the last Ming emperor tragically hanged himself in the palace gardens. He left behind a note lamenting his failure and a palace ripe for takeover. The Manchu, a foreign power from the northeast, swiftly swept in and established the Qing dynasty. Remarkably, they chose to keep the Forbidden City as their seat of power, adapting its existing traditions while subtly inserting their own. The architecture remained, but the language, dress, and rituals evolved once again. The red walls absorbed the shock of this transition and maintained the illusion of continuity. The Qing ruled from the Forbidden City for another 268 years, through periods of immense prosperity and devastating collapse. The late Qing emperors, especially during the 19th century, struggled desperately to adapt to modern pressures. Relentless Western imperialism, internal rebellions, and crippling technological stagnation. Meanwhile, Empress Dowager Cixi ruled from behind a curtain, quite literally, manipulating court politics while stubbornly refusing reforms that might have saved the empire. By the time the boy Emperor Puyi ascended the throne in 1908, the Forbidden City was more a museum than a true center of power. In 1912, the Qing dynasty fell, and with it, over 2 millennia of imperial rule. But oddly, Puyi was permitted to remain inside the Forbidden City for another 13 years, like a ghost wandering the ruins of his own past. The emperors were gone, but the city remained, hollowed out, majestic, and haunted by the echoes of vanished dynasties. The walls had survived, but the thrones within them had not. After the Qing dynasty fell in 1912, the Forbidden City theoretically should have gone silent. But instead, it entered one of the strangest chapters in its 5-century history. The monarchy was gone. China was now a republic. And yet, inside the crimson walls, a child emperor remained. Puyi, at age 6, still dressed in dragon robes, still bowing to empty rituals, and still ostensibly ruling over absolutely nothing. This bizarre arrangement was the result of a complex political compromise. The new Republican government allowed Puyi to remain in the inner court of the Forbidden City, cut off from Beijing's rapidly changing streets. Outside, warlords battled for power and revolution reshaped society. Inside, time stood eerily still. Eunuchs continued their duties, meals were served in ceremonial fashion, and the emperor woke, dressed, and was bowed to. A monarch without a monarchy, a boy living inside a dream already shattered. But Puyi wasn't blind. As he matured, he began to question the world around him. He read newspapers secretly smuggled into the palace. He saw airplanes fly overhead. Modernity buzzed incessantly outside his gates while he lived trapped in a museum of fading grandeur. And he knew, even if no one dared say it aloud, that the empire was truly gone. His profound isolation bred resentment, curiosity, and eventually a quiet defiance. In 1923, a massive fire erupted in the palace, a suspicious blaze that destroyed precious treasures. Puyi accused the eunuchs of theft and sabotage, and in a swift, decisive response, he expelled hundreds of them. Centuries of palace tradition vanished overnight. The Forbidden City was rapidly emptying out. By 1924, a warlord named Feng Yuxiang finally expelled Puyi from the palace altogether. The emperor, now a young man, was escorted out through the same gates emperors had ruled from for generations. He was carried in a rickshaw. No throne, no honor guard, just a displaced figure wrapped in the memory of vanished power. But Puyi's story didn't end there. He would later collaborate with the Japanese, become a puppet ruler in Manchuria, and eventually be captured, imprisoned, and re-educated by the communist regime. In his final years, he worked as a gardener, tending flowers in Beijing, living quietly not far from the very palace that had once defined him. Puyi was the last to live in the Forbidden City, and when he left, he took the empire's final breath with him. Today, the Forbidden City no longer hides secrets. It proudly displays them. What was once off-limits to nearly all of China is now open to millions. Renamed the Palace Museum, it stands as a monument not just to imperial grandeur, but to the complex layers of history, power, and identity that shaped a civilization. Walking through its gates today, visitors pass under the same towering red walls that once intimidated diplomats and echoed with the footsteps of eunuchs. The golden roofs still gleam in the sunlight, and the dragon motifs remain as fierce as ever. But now, instead of guards and courtiers, you'll find tour guides, selfie sticks, and school children with notebooks. The Forbidden City houses more than 1.8 million artifacts. Scrolls, paintings, porcelain, ceremonial garments, weapons, and personal belongings of emperors and empresses. But beyond the objects, what lingers most is the profound silence of rooms that once dictated the fate of millions. Empty thrones, closed doors, and vast courtyards whispering stories more powerful than any exhibit label. Restoration efforts have kept the complex remarkably intact, and yet the Forbidden City is more than merely preserved. It has been transformed. It's a living museum, a national symbol, and paradoxically, a place where the memory of autocracy now serves public education. The irony isn't lost. A palace built to exclude has become one of the most visited places on Earth. Still, beneath the tourist chatter and camera flashes, the deeper weight of the site persists. You feel it in the Hall of Supreme Harmony, where emperors once stood above a kneeling court. You feel it in the shaded corridors of the inner court, where whispers decided destinies. And you feel it in the tranquil gardens where lonely rulers once wandered among rock sculptures, longing for a world they could barely touch. In many ways, the Forbidden City is China's mirror, a reflection of grandeur, control, vulnerability, and enduring resilience. It's not just a relic of the past, it's a vital framework for understanding how history shapes the present. From isolation to revolution to public memory, it has seen every chapter, and it continues to watch, no longer as a seat of power, but as a silent witness to everything that followed after the empire's last breath.